The best cinematic settings for your Sony a7 III. Well, any cameras in general, really. In this third episode of my 5-part series to modern day travel filmmaking, I'm gonna give you a crash course in how to properly expose a shot, show you what frame rates to use, and how to shoot slow motion effectively. Essentially, by mastering these aspects of your camera, you'll be able to create some cinematic bangers. And to be honest, that's what 99% of newcomers mean when they want to know the best quote-unquote cinematic settings. Really, it's just getting the image to look right with the proper camera settings. Probably the most important visual aspect of filmmaking is having a properly exposed shot. In part 1 of the series, we briefly went over the concept of dynamic range, how the camera captures and retains details in the highlights and shadows. A good video would not have blown out highlights or super crushed shadows, so a good rule of thumb is when in doubt, always underexpose rather than overexpose, because it's easier to save shadow details than it is to recover blown out highlights. To avoid blown out highlights, I like to use the zebra feature. Yes, like the animal. Essentially, when you have zebras turned on, there'll be stripes on your LCD screen that tells you if you're overexposing. When you see that, adjust either your ISO or aperture settings until the stripes are gone. And here's how to set that up. Locate zebra settings in the menu and have it turned on. For level, set it at 100. You can place the zebra toggle and zebra level in your quick function menu for quick access in case you need to make adjustments later. A quick note to my more advanced beginners. We're not going to go over S-Log or hybrid log gamma in this series just because it requires you to overexpose the shot, which can get confusing and troublesome to grade in post later, especially if you're not used to shooting in a log profile. I'll have a separate video on this in the future, so be sure to subscribe to be notified when that drops. Moving on to white balance. Essentially, this is the way your camera tries to balance out the colors in the scene to make sure whites appear white. Using the correct white balance will ensure that you have the most accurate colors represented in the scene and will save you a lot of time later in editing, because fixing white balance can be very difficult. The symbols in this menu are good indicators telling you which to use in what situations. Sun for sunny broad daylight scenes, shade for shaded areas, cloud for cloudy rainy outdoor scenes, light bulb for indoor lit scenes. But when you're in a situation where neither of these look right, you can also dial in a specific Kelvin in the custom white balance option. Now, just like the zebra settings, I like to have the white balance settings in my quick function menu for quick access in case I need to change it on the fly. Moving on to frame rate. Generally, Hollywood feature films are shot in 24 frames per second, so it's important to have this in mind as our base frame rate when we shoot and when we set up our timeline sequence later in our editing software. When shooting a cinematic video, the one absolute rule to shutter speed is that it needs to double the frame rate you're shooting in. Since we're shooting at 24 frames per second, our shutter speed needs to be at 1/48 or 1/50, as that's the closest value our Sony can give us. But what happens when your shutter speed is over that value? You might run into a situation where it's a very bright scene, you want to shoot with the thinnest depth of field like f1.8 to have the maximum background blur, but you're already at the lowest ISO setting and the shutter speed is at the proper 150. Now, in order to compensate for that exposure, you may be tempted to ramp up your shutter speed, but by doing that, it causes a very jarring look in your film. Take a look at what a properly exposed scene with the optimal camera settings look like. As I'm waving my hands back and forth like a crazy person, I'm producing motion blur that looks natural, versus a properly exposed scene but with the shutter speed at 1/500, my hands are looking very freaky. So how will we go about making our shutter speed stay at 1/50 while maintaining the other camera settings we desire? By using ND filters. These are like sunglasses for your lenses. You have an option between a fixed ND filter or a variable ND filter. Now, if you're just starting out, I would highly recommend getting a variable ND instead, because that allows you to control how much light you're limiting as you rotate the ring, whereas a fixed ND filter already has a set amount of blockage. See some of the links in the description box below for my recommendations on ND filters. Okay, so now that we understand shutter speed and frame rate better, let's talk about shooting slow motion and how to shoot it effectively. So what's the benefit of shooting slow motion aside from it being cool? It creates emphasis on something you want your audience to focus on, and it's usually of details that are easily missed if you were to see in real life or shoot it in real time. When used correctly, you can really heighten the audience's emotion in the midst of your storytelling. Let's analyze this slow motion scene closely. When playback at standard 24 frames per second, the scene of Vivian walking across the street looks hectic. It's hard for the audience to focus on what's going on because of how fast-paced everything is. As an action scene, this would work well, but I want the audience to experience the famous Shibuya crossing without the hecticness. So because I slowed the clip down, we get to enjoy the scene more. We see the neon signs, the oncoming pedestrian crossing, people posing and jumping in the middle of the street, and even this gentleman opening up his umbrella. This is the power of slow motion. As of the creation of this video, our available slow motion options are 1080p 60 and 1080p 120. These two selections are considered high frame rate because we're shooting more than 24 frames per second. And because we'll be editing on a 24 frames timeline, if we shot in 60p, we can slow our footage down by 2.5 times or 40%. If we shot in 120p, we can slow our footage down by 5 times or 20%. By following our proper shutter speed rule, if we shot in 60p, our shutter speed would have to be 1/125. If we shot in 120p, our shutter speed would need to be at 1/250. So now that we have the settings down, when should we shoot in slow motion? Generally, I like to shoot in slow motion when I'm getting close-ups. It creates a lot of emphasis on the subject, and depending on the story you're trying to tell, it can heighten the audience's emotion at certain points of your film. However, I would avoid shooting slow motion if the action or camera movement is already slow, because then it looks like nothing's really happening. I would also avoid shooting slow motion when the subject of interest is a speck. Take a look at this scene of me jumping from a distance. Now take a look at this scene again, but as a close-up. Much more effective compared to the one where I'm an ant. Now, this doesn't mean you shouldn't ever shoot slow motion in a wide scene. Just make sure there are obvious movements happening, like the edge of the screen moving back, or utilizing foreground to exaggerate movement. Which, by the way, you're in luck because we're gonna go more in depth about those movements in the next episode. In the next episode, we're gonna be focusing on camera movements using a one-handed 3-axis stabilizer. I'm gonna show you a few basic gimbal techniques that can create powerful cinematic results. If you're just joining us on this series to modern day travel filmmaking out here in Japan, you'll find the full playlist of the entire series somewhere here on the screen. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.